remind everybody as we move through this webinar today, just to have your microphones muted, and you can leave your video on or turn it off, whatever you want to do. As I said with Ryan, we've had the chance to hear him speak last week and has some good, wonderful insight on what it means to be church in a digital age, and we're excited to hear what he has to share today. We're thankful that as three synods, the Southeastern Synod and North Carolina Synod and Virginia Synod, we can come together to do this. I think Michael mentioned we're up over 200 folks who've registered either to be here in person or to be on the list to get the recordings as we all think about what the future of ministry looks like in this digital format. We'll have, if you've got questions, you can put those in the Zoom chat. I can see someone's asked, are these sessions recorded? Yes, we are recording them. If you registered, got this link through the registration side of things, you should have gotten an email last Wednesday afternoon that had the recording from last week. If you didn't get that, you can just send a note to Pastor Michael. His piece in the chat says tech support. Pastor Michael, he's from the Southeastern Synod, and he's managing this part of everything. He's just posted the link to find that video from last week in the chat as well. So Pastor Michael, are there other things you want to add about the technology part of this?
Well, first of all, I'm Michael Jeanette, pastor, assistant to the bishop in the Southeastern Synod. Thank you all for joining us. This is a great turnout. And just to remind you, if you are registered, you should be receiving an email. If not, if you didn't receive an email and you are registered, you didn't receive that email on Wednesday, please chat me in the chat box. Tech support, Pastor Michael, that's how my name is listed right now. We are recording, yes, and so we'll have these recordings available. And like last week, we had various links that were posted in the chat box. We shared those via that email that was sent out last Wednesday. If you happen to register since last Wednesday, you might not have gotten that because it kind of went to those who are registered at that point. If you registered after Wednesday, just go ahead and, if you registered, assuming you did, if not, if somebody shared the link, that's fine. But if you register, that'll be, then you'll be sure to get the link, the follow-up email. So that's all I wanted to add. I'll put the registration link here in case, like maybe you borrowed the link from a friend, which is totally fine. If you register, then you'll be sure to get the emails each week, and then you'll be all caught up. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Ryan, well, we are, as I said, pleased to have you back, and we'll turn it over to you and let you get started with our conversation.
Well, thanks, Pastor John, and thank you to all of you for joining us this morning. Nothing like a little Zoom to talk about church in a digital age to get your week started off right. I'm broadcasting live this morning from my 10-month-old's playpen, also known as my basement and home office. And today we're going to be talking about what's next for virtual worship. This is the second of our three-part webinar series on being church in a digital age. Last week, if you haven't had a chance to watch, we talked about the case for prioritizing digital ministry, not just throughout the pandemic, but moving forward, recognizing that the pandemic will eventually end, the church will always have some kind of expression online. And we got into some of the case for why that's important. Today, though, we're going to turn our attention to worship. And when we talk about worship, I'm hopefully going to give you a few questions to consider when you think about next steps for doing virtual worship, both for the duration of worship from home, as well as when we look forward to the day when buildings reopen more widely and we can start creating what I refer to as a hybrid experience of worship, one that combines online and in person. Next Monday, we look forward to perhaps the hottest topic in the virtual church world, which is building digital community. And as we look ahead to next week, what I hope to do is give you a framework for designing solutions that will build community in very small ways, but meaningful ways within your context. And there's some learning goals stated here, but my primary goal as the presenter for this webinar series is to give you a space to think and to process about ministry in a digital age, to think about doing church online, recognizing that after 6 very fast-paced months, you might not have had a lot of those spaces. So we'll conclude our time today with about 10 minutes of breakout discussion where you can bounce some ideas off of other pastors and rostered leaders across each of the 3 synods. Just a few more notes on my background if you're just joining us for the first time. My name is Ryan. I live in Madison, Wisconsin, and I live at the intersection of church and technology, having spent my career either in the tech industry or in the church, usually in both worlds at once. And I'm the author of the upcoming book, Grace and Gigabytes, Being Church in a Tech-Shaped Culture. Just one logistical note, I do have the Zoom chat up in front of me, so feel free to post any questions to the Zoom chat, and I'll try to respond to those throughout the presentation today. All right, so our agenda for our time together this morning, we're going to briefly review some of the content for last week. Then we're going to get into a little bit of recipe building for online worship. And I'm going to define the 3 ingredients that are crucial to a successful online worship experience. And you've probably, whether deliberately or not, thought about all of these 3 ingredients. But the question is, how can we make those ingredients the highest possible quality moving forward? We'll talk a little bit about moving towards hybrid experience, looking months ahead for some churches here, and then we'll close with some breakout discussions. So before we get into some conversation about the 3 mindsets for successful digital age ministry, I just wanted to read our first question today. Comes from Chad, talking about Facebook changes to be implemented on October 1st and how this affects Facebook Livestream. Chad, I guess I'm not as familiar with the specific changes that are rolling out October 1st, but if you send me an email, I will look into it for you and respond with a few thoughts and follow up with the group as needed. So begin with a review of some of our ecclesiology from last week. The idea that the greatest work that church leaders can perform, that the Church of Christ can perform, is to bring those who are entrusted to us to the knowledge of God by the Holy Gospel. And this influences the topic of doing church online, because we saw with all of those statistics presented last week that those entrusted to us, whether they're millennials or silent generation or somewhere in between, are living online. They're part of this digital culture. And that's why this conversation matters both now and well into the future. So we begin with 3 mindsets then. Our first mindset, that digital culture matters a lot more than the technologies we use. The technologies we use change day by day, week by week. The apps we use today may not even be around tomorrow. And if you're looking at TikTok, for example, that one is a prime example of that. So it's always the idea of culture that's going to matter far more to the success of doing church online than any specific technologies. Our second mindset that we want to begin this work with is the idea that this work depends on successfully engaging digital values. Last week, we talked about how many of my coworkers in the tech industry have these perceptions about the way churches act and operate, and how these perceptions are disconnected from the values that they who live in this tech-shaped culture all espouse. Our job as church leaders isn't so much to change their minds about those perceptions or argue that those perceptions are wrong or misplaced. Rather, it's to think about how we can creatively engage these values of asking questions, of connecting in person and online, of promoting collaboration, and of facilitating creativity. Whatever we do with church online, whatever we do with church in the digital age, we will be successful in bringing the gospel to a new generation if we can engage the values on the right side of the slide. And our third mindset that we begin with, and I say this at the start of every presentation I do, is digital minimalism. The idea that we can't use all the technologies that are out there. We can't even keep up with the pace of new technologies being developed and launched. Our task is not to be voracious consumers of technology. Our job is to be thoughtful leaders, and to make sure that the technologies we use are well suited to the mission of our specific ministry context. So before we move into this conversation about worship online and these ingredients for success with virtual worship, there were a couple questions came up in the Zoom chat. Deborah Boland asked, with the short attention span that many, especially younger folks, seem to have these days, does that change your online church versus what you do in person? You know, Deborah, that is a really good question. With regard to attention span, there have been some studies recently that have compared the attention span of your typical millennial to that of the attention span of a goldfish, and have suggested that the goldfish has a longer attention span. I, as a millennial, take some umbrage to that. In fact, I spend a lot of my free time listening to these 90 to 120-minute podcasts, a lot of them involving like dense academic, philosophical, or theological back and forth. I don't think that there's a challenge with attention span. I think perhaps there's a challenge with content that's disinteresting, and that there's so much choice in digital content that it seems like attention spans are lower. So in something like worship, I don't think we need to think about shortening our worship or truncating the service or leaving things out that ought to be part of worship. Perhaps when we think about Christian education, faith formation, there's a piece we want to consider about like micro learning and being really, really brief with our content. But I would tend to give the virtual worshiper the benefit of the doubt that they're going to use that space for worship, that space for prayer. And in this time when everyone's feeling busy and harried and stressed out, that they really need that full experience of liturgy. I know of my fellow millennials, the folks I know who work in the tech industry that are going to church online, they're valuing that hour of worship on YouTube, perhaps more than they valued that hour of church ever before, because it's such a welcome break to the pace of our world right now. There was another question too about presentation slides. I use Google Slides, former Google employee. I pretty much am obligated to, at all times, at all places, use Google Docs for the rest of my life. So talking about worship online and 3 ingredients every church leader should focus on. What I'm going to do here is talk about the ingredients of how we share our worship via the platforms we use, whether we distribute our worship via broadcast or live stream, and the third ingredient is which software we use. And this is ultimately not going to be a deep dive into any one of these 3 segments, as much as it's going to be an invitation for you to think about all 3 of these ingredients, and if you're using the right ones for your ministry context. So when we talk about platforms for doing church online, there are 3 big platforms. And the difference between a platform and a piece of technology or an app, for example, is that a platform is where lots of people already find themselves. Lots of folks are interacting. A platform is the foundation on which our virtual church rests. So you might have heard of different software programs. All of those software programs for doing church online plug into these 3 platforms: Facebook, YouTube, and chances are you're using one of these 3. Facebook is going to be the platform that allows for the most social engagement. It's going to be the platform that is in many contexts the most widely used because of how widely used it was as a communications platform at the congregational level prior to COVID. It's also the platform where it's the easiest to reach those who aren't specifically planning to attend your worship service. If you go live on Facebook, those who follow your Facebook page will receive a notification that you've gone live. In many cases, that means a notification shows up on their phone screen and tells them that you have started a live sermon or a live worship service. So I think from a missional standpoint, Facebook offers the greatest opportunity to reach those who weren't planning to set foot in your virtual church on a Sunday morning. And that's the reason I love church on Facebook. Now, there's other things I love about YouTube and Zoom, which I'll talk about in just a moment here. But I wanted to give you a couple of examples that are a little bit biased because they're churches I've worked with in the past of Good Shepherd Lutheran in Madison and Our Savior's Lutheran in Appleton, Wisconsin. Good Shepherd uses Facebook, has used Facebook for a long time. As far as a multi-site congregation, we have one congregation in Madison, Wisconsin, and one congregation in Verona. So the Facebook has helped us to provide a streaming experience for both campuses. And if you work at a church that perhaps has 2 campuses or has multiple points, using Facebook allows you to stream one service on Facebook and one on YouTube. So all of your worship services and sermons can be broadcast digitally. I also mentioned Our Savior's Lutheran in that's a congregation I interned with when I was in college, and it's the congregation I grew up at. They are perhaps the most low-tech congregation I've ever worked with. But what they're doing so well right now are these 1-minute devotions posted every day with Facebook Live. It's called 1 Minute at a Time. And they're just meant to provide 1 minute of encouragement, 1 minute of prayer every day. It's broadcast by either a deacon or one of the pastors at the church. And they're no experts in technology, and they would be the first to admit it. But they were fast out of the gate to use this live technology and to broadcast live. And as I'm scrolling through my Facebook feed every day, it's just a nice little break from some of the frenetic things going on in our world. So again, Facebook, just to recap, a really good missional opportunity, good in the sense that it was widely used as a communications network platform prior to COVID. And it's good because it's also a nice platform for comments, for likes, and for sharing as well. A couple of folks here have talked about Vimeo, and indeed Vimeo live stream is perhaps the 4th of the platforms for live worship. I leave Vimeo out because of this slide specifically, because Vimeo is used by less than 1% of churches for their live stream. It's also a paid platform. So if you use the Vimeo live stream platform, it's a pay for access, whereas Facebook Live offers free streaming. But yeah, do look into Vimeo live stream. I'm going to come back to Vimeo live stream in just a moment here to talk a little bit more about this. There was another question, can a live service be streamed on Facebook and Zoom at the same time? In fact, it can. And a lot of churches that I've looked at for examples of church online are using Zoom and Facebook simultaneously. Upper Dublin Lutheran in Ambler, Pennsylvania, I believe is also taking their Zoom services and broadcasting to YouTube and Facebook simultaneously. And then Nathan Boynton here said they've been using Vimeo for a while, which has made it easy to download material to share in our own service. That's excellent. Yeah, that's a really good, helpful comment, Jonathan. One thing with Facebook and YouTube is that you can actually download an MP4 file from those services. So if downloading a file and sharing it is of value to your congregation, then Vimeo live stream is a useful platform. To talk a little bit about YouTube then, YouTube is going to be a good platform because it can be shared so easily. All you need is the URL for your YouTube broadcast. Nobody needs to create a Facebook platform. Nobody needs to create a Zoom account. Anybody can access it. It's got very low barriers to entry. One of the challenges, however, with YouTube is that it's perhaps a little bit more more labor intensive to get the word out about what you're doing on YouTube. You have to go through some effort to share the link that you're going to be worshiping on. And nobody's going to be on YouTube casually browsing on a Sunday morning. Your worship come up, click, and then watch. That's just not necessarily the behavior we see with YouTube. So it takes a little bit more communications work to get the work out. In exchange for doing that communications work, though, YouTube does give you the best control over broadcast quality. It has the most settings available, the most ways to edit a video, to annotate a video, and to share a video after the fact. So I like YouTube as a content creator because there's just so many things I can customize. The Episcopal National Cathedral does a great job with their Sunday morning YouTube service. They're one of my favorite online worship providers, and they have been for years. One of the things I like about the Episcopal National Cathedral is how they leverage different annotations so that you can follow along in English or Spanish, how they have a sign language interpreter alongside, and that's language interpreter is in a split screen during something like a sermon. So their service is renowned for their accessibility and the effort they make for their content to be inclusive and accessible. A couple of questions have popped up about Facebook and YouTube and whether you can use Facebook and YouTube simultaneously. You can indeed broadcast to Facebook and YouTube simultaneously, but it requires some software. And so in just a moment here, I'll tell you a little bit about that software and what it would take to broadcast to both at the same time. And then finally, to say a few words about Zoom. Zoom is probably the most common platform amongst smaller congregations and congregations where sense of community is really strong. What I love about Zoom is that it has a strong sense of built-in interactivity. Anybody can come off mute and contribute to a prayer or a reading or a children's sermon. You can't do that as easily with Facebook and YouTube. In fact, you would need to purchase some software to have access to some of those tools. Zoom is also another easy platform to share because it just requires a URL. And if you're going to be doing the communications work like with YouTube and sharing that URL, it's going to be no different for Zoom. I think one of the easiest ways to build community in this digital age, and community building will be the topic for next week's webinar, is to get people involved with worship leadership. And Zoom allows you to do that quite easily just by telling someone what to say, when to say it during the liturgy. I have Upper Dublin Lutheran in Ambler, Pennsylvania. That's Keith Anderson's church, Pastor Keith Anderson's church, the author of Click to Save, which is one of the books I mentioned last week. And one of the things I would mention about their service is how their pastors welcome their attendees by name as they join the Zoom. That's one of the nice benefits of Zoom is you can see the names and faces of those worshiping with you. So they specifically greet all attendees by name and welcome them. And it's just a lovely way to build community, whereas Facebook and YouTube offer more of a broadcast and less of a communal feel. Another good question in the Zoom chat, and this is something that I regret has become part of our calculus for how we do church in a digital age. Matt Lindler talks about having some challenges with spammers, commenting on services, leaving inappropriate material. They want to keep comments open, but have had to cut off commenting. Do you have any suggestions? Matt, would you mind sharing the Zoom chat which of these platforms you use for worship? I would assume from the looks of it that you might be using Zoom if you're having people cut into the worship service. But while Matt is doing that, so the idea of spamming or Zoom bombing has come up in recent months, and only recently have these platforms moved to address it. If you're using Zoom, I would simply encourage you to use a password for your Zoom call, or if not to use a password, to use the waiting room and let folks in. My wife, who's a high school science teacher, has had a lot of students trying to prank their fellow students by joining Zoom rooms with funny names, Like if you've ever seen The Simpsons and Bart Simpson calling Moe's Tavern with the funny names, that's the kind of antics they're following, and it's funny and it's comical, but it can get quite serious in other contexts. So for Zoom specifically, I would encourage you to use a password or to use a waiting room. As far as something like YouTube has always had challenges with its comment section, and its comment section has kind of been a notorious place for trolling. Matt, what my suggestion would be is to find another platform for facilitating dialogue if that is your goal during your worship service. The YouTube comment section is it's almost like a safe haven for trollers. I would look into apps like GroupMe. I would look into even something like using WhatsApp in order to create a group for your congregation and using those applications to communicate back and forth during the service. And Barbara commented, we've disabled the comments on YouTube. Many congregations have. I think that's kind of the sad reality of YouTube, is it's always been known as a place where the comment section is not the best of humanity and not the best of the internet. So if our first ingredient is the platform we use for doing worship, the second ingredient is our distribution. And with distribution, we have two options. We have live stream and we have recording. Most churches seem to be doing live stream at this point, primarily because it affords some kind of a spirit of togetherness. There's also a certain level of forgiveness on content quality. It's also easier, I think, to pay attention to something that's happening live than to go back and watch a recording of what happened in the past. That's the reason why, if you've ever tried to watch a recording of a webinar, it's not quite as interesting as a webinar that's happening synchronously. All of these platforms afford the ability to do live streaming, and all you need is an internet connected device to make live streaming happen. Upgrade I recommend to churches that are doing live streaming is to experiment with different types of hardware for making the live stream service happen. The Mevo camera is a powerful live streaming tool that many churches are using. You just plug it into a USB port and it's like magic in how it beams the service to these different platforms. It's specifically a camera that's built for live streaming. The other distribution tactic is recording of a service. And what I like about recording is it affords that ability to be involved as a community. In churches I've seen who have done a good job with recording, they'll invite calls for submissions throughout the week, where members of the congregation might record a prayer or a children's sermon or a short reflection, even a benediction. And if you're a savvy user of something like QuickTime or iMovie, you can take MP4 files and edit them together. There's also recording software that allows you to have your choir perform, all from the safety of their own houses, but stitch together their own performances. What I want to say about live stream and recording is, by now you've probably selected one of these two for your primary worship distribution strategy. Don't change that. Stick with what you're doing now. The opportunity is to experiment with the other formats outside of your Sunday morning service. We'll get back to that in just one moment. Finally, we come to software, our third and final ingredient with worship. And you can do church online without any software. In fact, prior to COVID-19, I think most live streaming was probably just pastors with a phone on Facebook Live. So all of these software programs are relatively new. There's an ecosystem that is somewhat split into secular software, by which I mean software that's not specifically made for a church experience, and then the software that is specifically designed for worship and for churches to use. Vimeo Livestream is, I guess if you could call something a secular software platform, one of those examples, as well as vMix and Doccast. Whereas church-specific software includes Truthcast, Christian World Media, and streamingchurch.tv. All of these software platforms do roughly the same thing at loosely the same price points. What you're going to see when you look at their websites is a difference in like marketing collateral and marketing materials. So what I want to do is give you a few questions to ask as you evaluate different software providers. I don't necessarily have a strong opinion about what software works best for everybody, but I have found that the questions on this slide are helpful in evaluating different software vendors. The first question, is the software going to allow you to integrate with the existing worship platform that you're currently using? If you're using YouTube and Facebook, I would guess that 100% of these software platforms will make that feasible. Not all of these software platforms are compatible with Zoom. So you'll want to make sure that when you look at software platforms, you make sure that there's a match to the platform you currently use. The second thing you'll want to consider is whether that vendor has features that help you to move beyond what you're currently doing. If the software just beams your service to YouTube and Facebook simultaneously, it might not be that great of a value add. But if the software allows you to annotate lyrics, to incorporate MP4 videos in your live stream worship, to incorporate more images along with your sermon, then yeah, by all means, look at that software further. It merits further consideration. The feasibility of use, given your context's technical requirements, is also really important to consider. Not all enterprise software is going to work with a church building that has low internet bandwidth. So if you talk to a sales rep or you reach out to a marketing department or a support department at one of these software providers, ask for minimum bandwidth. And if you don't know what minimum bandwidth means, just ask them, does your software work well if we have slow internet? If your congregation doesn't have great digital expertise, some of these platforms are going to be better than others as well. Many congregations are blessed with those who have worked professionally in movie and sound editing over the years. Most congregations probably are not. So the easiest way to evaluate numbers 3 and 4 on this list is to ask for a trial. Most of these software providers will give you 30 days, 42 days, different durations for you to test their software. And it's really important to make sure that whatever software you select works given where your church is at. Quality of tech support is crucial. If a company doesn't offer you tech support on Sunday mornings, I would avoid using their platform. There's a lot of stories of pastors who have been panicked at 10:29 a.m. on a Sunday because suddenly they can't open the software that they need to stream their worship service. So please make sure that they have a phone number, or if not a phone number, some kind of live chat support. If they offer you email support, they won't get back to you right away. So only purchase software for worship if you have a line of contact when you need it the most. And finally, the last one of the factors that I have lowest on this list is cost, because there's not that much variability between these different platforms, and I'm a believer that with how long we're going to be doing church online, and with the church's future being a digital future, you should be investing based on numbers 1 through 5 on this list before you think about investing based on number 6. All right, I'm going to pause there because we have a few questions, a few comments in the chat as well. So thanks everyone for the great questions and engagement. Christina mentions doing a combination of live on Facebook and Zoom, and then editing the videos and posting to YouTube. YouTube provides automatic caption for the hearing impaired. Yes, they do indeed. YouTube has a number of these really nice video editing features that come for free with the platform. And Christina, that's a really creative use of YouTube. export the recording from Zoom and posting to YouTube. And that way, if you have a newsletter, you can circulate that YouTube link to those who want to watch later. You don't have to worry about packaging an MP4 and sending it with your newsletter. Jonathan had a comment about upgrading to AT&T fiber by the end of the month as preparing for Vimeo Livestream. Yeah, now is a good time to think about your church's network capabilities. Last week we saw that 1 in 3 churches didn't have Wi-Fi in their buildings prior to COVID. So make sure you have Wi-Fi that's fast enough, not just for your office staff on Monday through Friday, but to support enough upload and download speeds to create a good worship experience. And then another comment here from Marianne, live stream on Facebook and YouTube plus record for YouTube, and are currently upgrading our sanctuary with new cameras and technology. Well, it's wonderful to see how many churches have tried new things, are upgrading hardware, are trying different cameras. Seems like a lot of great innovation happening with this group. So before we turn it over to our breakout discussions, I want to kind of challenge you gently to explore a few next steps for your specific congregation. And what I'm going to do is propose a few ideas based on where your congregation is currently at with doing worship online. So for congregations that are using live streamed content, what I would encourage you to do is to think about recording different content pieces throughout the week and bringing your community together to watch that content together using something like a Facebook watch party or a YouTube party. So there's been comments about like trolls and spammers with, so a Facebook watch party is a nice way to bring those who are following your Facebook page together for a conversation. Where I've seen this work really well is when pastors have recorded like a short adult education video and then brought together their adult ed groups on Facebook at a certain time to premiere that video, to watch it together, and to respond to some questions that are posted on the Facebook watch party. My church actually watched a documentary, so it doesn't have to be pre-produced, or it doesn't have to be custom produced content. If you have a documentary or a movie that you want to watch, you can watch it together on Facebook, YouTube, or Netflix and discuss it as it's happening. For the recording broadcasters, if you record your Sunday service, I would encourage you to experiment with Instagram and Facebook Live during the week. I talked about our Saviors in Appleton, Wisconsin, and how they're doing very low-tech productions of this 1 minute at a time devotional series. Try something like that and see how it works. If nothing else, you'll get to learn a new technology. But I love these live streaming tools and the access, the missional opportunity they give you to reach those that weren't intending to walk into a church. And then for the Zoom users, the challenge that I would give to you is to figure out how to make your Zoom experience highly collaborative. I have a logo here for Nadia Bowles-Weber's House for All Sinners and Saints Church. And in her book, Pastor Nadia talks about having envelopes. And when people would walk into the sanctuary, they could pick up an envelope that would have a worship leadership role described in the envelope. So you could pick an envelope and maybe you would be the lector that day, or you could pick an envelope, maybe you would be reading the benediction at the end of the service. Use Zoom to the fullest of its collaborative capabilities and invite your congregation to take an active role leading the service. You don't even have to plan this ahead of time. You could create Google Docs that have the different roles and invite people to take up those roles during the Zoom call or at the start of the Zoom call. That is by far the biggest benefit of using Zoom, is that collaborative capability. I also have here Play resource, and I've talked to a number of Episcopal priests who are using this godly play for 15 minutes at the end of their Zoom worship, just to have some discussion, some faith formation conversation, wondering about what God is up to within their community, and wondering aloud on a Zoom call. So even though the service ends with the blessing and benediction, your Zoom call might not end there. And you might actually end the Zoom call with a little bit of conversation and wondering aloud at the end of the call. Another question from the Zoom, Christina asked what were the 3 ingredients, and their platform, distribution, and software is the third ingredient. The last thing I'm going to talk about briefly is this topic of building a bridge between our worship that's happening online and our worship that's happening in the building. And this is a conversation that matters when we look to the joyous day when our buildings can reopen safely and all can be welcomed back into the sanctuary. Now, we know that that's not going to happen at the same date and time for every church. And we know that not all of our church members will feel comfortable returning to the building on the same Sunday. So it's important to consider how we can create some parity between online worship and in the building worship, even in these months when many of us aren't offering worship in the building. Just to talk about 3 things that may well happen as church buildings start to reopen. You'll have churches that will stop doing anything online. You'll have churches that will continue to live stream worship as an alternative to attendance at the building. And you'll also have churches, and this is the ideal that we should strive for, that succeed in building a bridge between offline and online worship. Just to talk briefly about all 3 of these, online church is, so many congregations will stop doing online church altogether. This is the scenario that's most likely for small congregations without many staff resources. The advantages of this is it's going to free up some time when your church building reopens. But the disadvantage is that you'll lose out on everything you learned about doing church online during this very long time when we did church online. So if you take nothing else away from this, take away this plea. Please do not stop doing church online, offering a virtual worship service, offering virtual sermons whenever your church building reopens. The idea of a live stream alternative is the idea that some congregations will provide a live stream experience, but it won't be very participatory, it won't be collaborative, it'll be kind of a passive sit and get worship experience. The real experience will be happening in the building. This will be really easy to do because it just simply requires you to keep doing what you're already doing. The drawback is that it doesn't effectively integrate your church community. It doesn't create that hybrid connection that's so prevalent in the digital age. What we should strive for then is an integration between our online and offline worship. There aren't a lot of best practices on how to do this yet, but we have time to think about this, potentially many months to think about this. The question is, how can we build community across those worshiping from home and those worshiping in the building using some creativity and inventiveness along the way? And just to introduce the conversation about this is a conversation that will start now and will last months, but using inclusive language when buildings reopen to greet those who are worshiping at home, to pray for those who are worshiping online, to think about using screens creatively. If you're using Zoom, for example, can you have a TV screen in your sanctuary so everyone can see who's joining the online service? Or if you really feel creative, could you have somebody who's worshiping via Zoom or worshiping at home call in to do a reading or to do a prayer or to lead a song? Ultimately, as long as the church has worship, there will likely be somebody worshiping online. We won't know for years how to fully integrate the two, but now is certainly the time to start thinking about this. Oh, Pastor John Wirtz, Lifelong Learning at Virginia Theological Seminary, hosted a webinar on this and has a suggested list of resources in the comments. Thanks for sharing that. Yes, follow follow lifelong learning at VTS, follow their e-formation programs. Certainly they are a major thought leader in doing church online. All right, I'm going to skip ahead here. And just a few closing thoughts. Again, what we're dealing with here is ministry in a digital age as something that's permanent, something we're only getting started with. As a result, we want to use this time to do some planning, to be thoughtful and strategic about where we go next with our worship, about where we go next with our platforms, with our distribution, with our software. And as I ended last week, I encourage you to remember that this work will challenge and stretch us all. This will be a steep learning curve for everybody, whether you're a digital native or just getting started with technology. Remember to give yourself some grace and some patience as well. So we're going to go into some breakouts here. In just a moment, you'll see on your screen an invitation to join a breakout room. And if you've never done a breakout room on Zoom, it's a grouping of, I think we'll have 4 people in each room today to discuss for about 10 minutes some discussion questions that are pertinent to today's webinar. So this is your chance to reflect and contextualize some of this material. And our questions for today are: what platforms, distribution, and software are you using currently? And also, what trends are you noticing? What's happening to engagement and attendance in your church? So, well, again, you'll see in just a minute an opportunity to join the breakout. Feel free to discuss these 2 questions or anything else that might be on your mind with the topic of doing worship online.
All right, folks, if you're still hanging out here, we invite you to accept the invitation to the small group breakout room at this time. Folks, thanks for being here. If you have a chance, you can accept that invitation to the breakout room. There'll be anywhere from 2 to 4 people in your breakout room if you get a chance to accept that invitation. It's okay if you can't make it in there. You just can hang tight with us for a little bit, and we will all be coming back together here at 11:55.
Okay, Michael and John, were there questions that you saw come through the Zoom chat that we haven't addressed yet?
The only question that was popping up a couple different times was about licensing and like music, and somebody posted a link to a talk about it, but copyright issues if we're going to be live streaming across multiple platforms.
Right.
How do we do that?
Yeah, that's the main one. Somebody else mentioned, you know, on Easter, everybody was on Zoom and it crashed.
Wow.
Should we expect the same for Christmas Eve? So that was another question that'll be coming up. Hey, folks who are here, we tried to make an invite to small group rooms. If you're not in there, I apologize. Trying to see those who are not assigned. Brian, do you remember where to click if you've been assigned to a breakout room and you didn't join in at first? Is there a way to?
You would have to create a new breakout room, and
Okay. I don't know if I could do that while they're open. So.
I also see we have someone waiting in the waiting room to get in. Esther.
Oh, Esther. Okay, yeah, I'll let Esther in.
We could also, while we're all waiting here, if anyone wants to share
Yeah.
a little bit about what's happening in their context, we could have a big breakout right here. And our questions are on the screen. What platforms are you using? What trends are you noticing? Feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to share a little bit about what's happening in your world. And I'll start. So my congregation is, well, I'll speak work with a number of congregations, but I'll speak for my home congregation, the one I grew up with in Appleton, is primarily using Facebook. They're using a live recording on Facebook. They actually aren't using any software other than a mobile phone with a cheap tripod, and I think it's working pretty well. Engagement was a little higher to Easter and kind of the start of the pandemic. It's dropped off a little bit, but these live stream videos have brought some folks back to engaging again.
This trends towards the engagement conversation that'll come next week, Ryan. But I joined a Zoom worship service last week because I'm going to be leading it in a couple of weeks. And someone on the Zoom who had met me before noticed that I had joined and sent a private welcome in the Zoom chat. Which I told the pastor afterwards. I said I didn't know if that was an intentional greeter who was doing that ministry or someone who just did it because that's who they are as a person. But certainly that would be, from an engagement standpoint, was something that made a stronger connection to that particular Zoom worship for me than the ones I just pop into from time to time.
Certainly more of a communal feel there than like with I mentioned the Episcopal National Cathedral, where you don't get any of that communal feel. Some churches who have an evening service or maybe a contemporary Sunday night service have started using Zoom for their Sunday night services, and they'll use YouTube and Facebook for the morning. So those who are perhaps used to a smaller service, maybe it's more contemplative, maybe it's more communal, can get that experience the Sunday evenings.
One of the engaging things we did before we started streaming our services in my previous congregation was one of the new members was very active in youth leadership in another church, and when they came to our church, became a volunteer and was out on a retreat with some of our youth, and so we just FaceTimed, and I held the phone in front of the congregation, and we walked through the affirmation of baptism service to welcome him in as a new member. So the youth group was with him, and the other adult leaders were with him, and his wife was home with us in the congregational space. So it was kind of fun to bridge that gap there. So,
very cool.
Well, we're at 11:55.
You want to call everyone back?
Yeah. I'll broadcast 30 seconds and then we'll know to come back.
I started confirmation last night, restarted, and I find myself so exhausted today from trying to think through how to keep them engaged. And they all were not talkative because, as they told me, we're not allowed to do this in school, because I gave them permission to answer and talk and unmute themselves, and they wouldn't do it. So I'm like,
we're all in this new thing. So
that's great.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, everyone, welcome back. I hope the breakouts today gave you a chance to pause and talk about how things are going in your context. Maybe you had an opportunity to think about those 3 ingredients of worship online and how you might optimize or augment the ingredients you're using as we look forward to the future of virtual worship. A few closing notes for today. Next week's webinar is going to focus on the topic of community building and how we can get back some of the community engagement. And I'm going to use that time not to offer like a silver bullet recipe for this is what you do to build community, but I'm going to almost give you a training in a process called design thinking and how we can use the design thinking process to create micro moments of community that bring our congregations together during these distributed times. Just a couple of also quick plugs. If you want to learn more about these topics, I do offer a weekly-ish newsletter on ministry in a digital age. You can sign up for the newsletter at ryanpanzer.com. And then there are still a couple of seats left in a learning community that I'll be running through Luther Seminary this fall. And that learning community is going to read 2 books on the topic of church online, and we'll collaboratively work to design and implement projects for your specific ministry context. So that's on the Faith Lead website. There's a link to it in the slides, which I'll send out as well, should you want to learn more about that opportunity. Finally, there were a few other questions I noticed we didn't get to today. There were some questions about Facebook. There were some questions about live streaming. If today or any of these webinars, there was a question that you didn't have the answer to, you can always send me an email and I'd be happy to look into it further, or you can send your Synod office an email. They can forward it on to me as well. I'm happy to continue the conversation. So that's all we have for this morning. Thank you all so much for joining, for your attention, for your engagement, for your great ideas. And I'll hang out for a few minutes if anyone wants to chat for a few minutes longer. We'll see you all next Monday.
Thanks, Ryan. We'll have email out later this week with a recording of the service and some of the links that were in recording of the webinar and some of the links that were in the chat. Thanks, everybody.
Hey, Ryan, can you hear me? You were talking about design thinking. Can you recommend, do you have a favorite blog or podcast that talks about that? Because I've heard about it and I've seen discussions about it, but just want to know what you thought.
The one I use is IDEOU. I'll throw it in the Zoom chat here. IDEOU. And I think some of their resources are free, like blog posts. They also have some paid courses, but kind of an authoritative source that I've worked with in the tech industry to do some design thinking in various contexts.
Ryan, can I throw out a question? I popped into the chat. So on Easter, it seemed like a lot of folks had their Zoom crash. And I just am wondering if that is something that we need to plan around for Christmas Eve, since there'll be such high usage at that time as well.
So was it Zoom that crashed, or was it your church's internet that crashed?
Well, we also had a crash that was totally unrelated, but I know a lot of churches, I think their Zooms totally went down, and there was a statement that came out of Zoom. I'm not sure what the statement was because we didn't get it, but I don't know if anybody else could add to that information.
I've heard of some churches as well that had some issues with this. I posted the Zoom requirements for bandwidth. They will list in that article what internet bandwidth you need on your end to make a Zoom broadcast work. And you can even just do a Google search for bandwidth checker, and it'll tell you if you have enough internet bandwidth to make that level of connection work for your ministry. As far as like total bandwidth goes, Zoom also has built in a number of different layers of technical redundancy, which is to say, like, they've become a lot more reliable since April. Their usage has spiked so much. I think they were experiencing this spike and hadn't built the technical capacity to process it. Is it good to have a backup for Christmas Eve? Absolutely. But I would not expect that the same thing that happened on Easter will happen in December 24th.
Thank you.
What you might look at doing is recording a service on YouTube, or recording a service as an MP4 and just having it on YouTube as an unlisted link. And then if the worst does happen, if it crashes, you can take that link, which nobody can access if it's unlisted, and you can make it publicly visible. That immediately makes that video searchable and viewable to anyone. So you have a fail-safe should the worst case scenario occur. I don't think it will, but that could be your backup.
Thank you.
Ryan, this is Donald Miller in Kings Mountain, North Carolina.
Hello.
I have a question regarding like CCLI and one license. How are we dealing with those using online worship?
Yeah, great question. And notice this came up a number of times. I've heard different things from different congregations. What my congregation does is it posts its license number along with the recording. And if you post your license number, so they use it as an annotation and it shows underneath the video. And for whatever reason, that seems to work. And I'm not as much of an expert in CCLI as I am about doing church online, but it sounds like this is a topic where there's a lot of discussion. So I'll do some research into this and come back next week with a more definitive point of view on that.
Thank you.
You bet.
Ryan, I serve a very elderly congregation in Virginia, toward the northern part of Virginia. Very tiny, double digits in in-person worship is a good day. And they're very traditional. They are not really interested in anything new unless it gets them in contact with their grandchildren. But church is only supposed to be in person. And I'm preparing recorded worship from my home because the church has no resources. There's no internet. With my limited equipment and sending it out as a YouTube recording, with sending the links by email and putting them on the Facebook and website. And most of them are not paying any attention. They're just complaining because I'm not giving them anything. And so, all of these suggestions, I'm just wondering what pastorally is possible to engage people with online worship when they really are shut up in their boxes, the way we've always done things.
It's a great question. And so a few things that I've heard, some congregations are recording DVDs and mailing out or distributing DVDs. Some have an easier time with DVDs. Other congregations have distributed Chromebooks and iPads and done socially distanced trainings on how to use that technology. All of that kind of depends on what's happening in your context, and some of that may not address the root question of, is digital really an authentic expression of church? And if that is a really burning question in your congregation, what I might recommend is some kind of a book study of Deanna Thompson's work, The Virtual Body of Christ in a Suffering World, which is a book. It's a short book. It's a very approachable book. And it's 100% dedicated to that question of, can authentic Christian relationships, can authentic Christian practice take place in virtual environments?
May I add something?
Of course.
Hi, I'm Jamie Loudon from Stevens City, Trinity. I have a significant number of folks in the congregation that are very much like that Pastor was just describing. The one way I've been able to reach out is through a telephone conference. So although those folks are still at home, I can talk with them all together. We have a time of just conversation and then a brief worship service. So it's
Great. Totally
low tech, but it works really well.
And that is technology.
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes we think that technology has to have the internet connection. But in fact, you know, during this time, you can use a DVD, you can use a phone, even print on paper is a form of technology. And that's why it's important to really think about the particulars of your context. Certainly it's great to hear that like using a phone bridge is working well. And by all means, keep doing that. I'm glad to hear it's working.
The company that I use is Free Conference, and it is free.
Yeah,
so you can
I think they
set it
just
up.
have like a thing when you dial in, like this is a free conference.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Mhm.
May I jump in one moment, please? I have a friend of mine who's an Episcopal priest, small congregation, and they just began using someone holding up iPhone or Android and just videotape or filming it, broadcasting it live, I should say, onto Facebook. That's how they started. So you can bypass the folks who are uncomfortable with it by simply, you know, and eventually put it onto a tripod, and that's how they continue to broadcast their services live via Facebook.
May I go back to something that Ryan is going to be working on, and that's of copyrights. I'm Pastor Heidi Moore, Resurrection in Fredericksburg, Virginia. There are trolls who are out there who will look for ways to sue you if you don't have the proper copyrights, or if you don't have the proper licenses, or if you're not using them properly. They will come get you. We had Facebook interrupt our live stream about the 4th Sunday in Lent. And the people who were watching that, just all of a sudden, we went down to no viewers. And what Facebook had done with their algorithm or whatever they do, it thought that we were using a piece of music that we had no license to be using, and so they shut us down. They were wrong. We did have, and we had done all the proper notations and this, that, and the other. So this is very particular thing that needs to happen. We have CCLI and CCVI. We have one license, and we just acquired CCS, which is Copyright Solutions, because there were pieces of music that we wanted to use that we couldn't use because they weren't covered by any of our license. You have to make sure that it is not only for live streaming, but for recorded music. So what we found was that if we had something that was prior recorded, we couldn't use it because our licenses didn't cover that. So it's very intricate, and we spend about an hour for each service vetting and making sure that our numbers and our licenses are done. And then of course you have to keep up with the reporting. So I'm just saying there's a lot that goes into that.
Yeah, and I don't envy you the heartache that must have caused to have that worship stream interrupted. I did post a link in the Zoom chat to the CCLI, their official point of view about this, and they talk about how yes, this is intended to cover the live services on webcasts, also covers third-party social media platforms, and it talks about video upload processes. So there's to look into here, and I'll plan to address some of it next week. So thanks everyone for the really good questions, and looking forward to speaking with you all next Monday.
Thank you all. Take
Bye
care.
everyone.